Welcome back to Alumni Weekend. We're here today with award-winning radio host, best-selling author, and acclaimed TV host, Micheal Smerconish, Lehigh class of 1984. Settle down, you 84s. Micheal graduated from Lehigh with degrees in journalism and government. After Lehigh, Micheal went on to earn his Juris Doctor from the University of Pennsylvania. He is currently the host of the Micheal Smerconish program on Sirius XM Radio and the host of CNN's Smerconish on Saturday mornings. He has interviewed President Obama on 7 different occasions, as well as Presidents Jimmy Carter, George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, and George W. Bush, and Vice Presidents Al Gore, Dick Cheney, and Joe Biden. He has been recognized extensively for his work in radio and television. Micheal has been an MSNBC contributor and frequent guest host of Hardball for Chris Matthews. He has also been a guest on several television programs, including the NBC Today Show, The Colbert Report, O'Reilly Factor, Larry King Live, The View, and Real Time with Bill Maher. As if that didn't keep him busy enough, Micheal is also the author of 5 books, 2 of them New York Times bestsellers. He also authors a Sunday column in the Philadelphia Inquirer. Prior to turning to broadcasting as a full-time endeavor, Micheal practiced law for 10 years with James E. Beasley, a legendary Philadelphia-based trial lawyer, who is the namesake of the Beasley School of Law at Temple University. Micheal is of counsel to the Philadelphia law firm of Klein & Spector and is a member of the Bar of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. When actively practicing law, he was a trial lawyer specializing in complex tort litigation. His work spanned various subject areas, including contracts, medical malpractice, and products liability. We are thrilled to welcome Micheal back to campus for his presentation about polarization in politics. Please hold your questions for him until the end of the session, and now I'm pleased to introduce to you Micheal Smerconish.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Shannon left one thing out, and that is that I was only invited to come back to campus and speak when 2 months ago I received my own television program on CNN on Saturday mornings at 9 a.m. In fact, I just left CNN in New York City, having delivered that show, to come back to South Mountain and speak to all of you. I presume from that invitation that that means that for the next 30 minutes I am to stand here and give you a briefing on missing Malaysian Flight 370. Jim Durkin, my fraternity brother, is next up as a speaker. I also want to make clear that I'm here because I appreciate Linderman. He's here because he'd never seen the inside of this library. I'd like to spend some time and talk about our political climate. I want to talk about how we got where we are. I'll say a word or two about where we're headed in 2014 and 2016, and hopefully you'll have some comments or some questions and we can have a good conversation. I have been paying attention for 35 years. I came of age politically on this campus in the Reagan 80s. I cut my teeth in GOP politics. I had extraordinary experiences when I was young. They included serving as an advance man for Vice President George Herbert Walker Bush, and if I get the opportunity, I want to tell you how that came to pass. When I was 29, I was appointed by President George Herbert Walker Bush to a sub-cabinet level position that gave me responsibility for the Department of Housing and Urban Development in 5 states and Washington, D.C. And my media work sprung from those unique political experiences. So on a day-to-day basis, as Shannon mentioned, I spend 3 hours a day hosting a radio program for Sirius XM, largely talking about politics. I write a weekly column for the Philadelphia Inquirer on Sundays. My 6th book just came out last week. It's available at the bookstore, and it's called Talk. It's a novel. And now I host the program on CNN. And I say that just in terms of presenting some credentials for the opinion that I want to offer. Having paid close attention for 3 decades, eating, sleeping, and drinking these things on a day-to-day basis, I want you to know that I've never seen a political climate in Washington as polarized as it is today. And I maintain that our elected officials in D.C. are far more polarized in their thinking than the rest of us, And the question that I often ask myself is, well, how exactly did we get here? And there are 9 considerations that I want to run through in terms of how I think things got to where they are today. And the first of them has to do with me defending the statement that Washington has never been as polarized in modern times as it is today. Consider this. In the early 1980s, on Ronald Reagan's watch, 60% of the Senate comprised of moderates. 60% comprised of moderates. So many Republican moderates in the early 80s that they had a gathering of their own, and they called it the Wednesday Lunch Club. And the Wednesday Lunch Club had about 24 members in it, individuals like John Hines and Arlen Specter, Alan Simpson, Bob Packwood, Nancy Kassebaum, Bob Dole. If I stood here long enough, I could probably name most of the 24. Today, there are literally none. And that's not me making a subjective judgment. The National Journal, year after year, takes the ideological pulse of the House and the Senate. They identify 100 or so votes where you can easily discern a conservative versus a liberal perspective, and then they do a tally. Every Republican in the Senate today is more conservative than every Democrat in the Senate. Every Democrat in the Senate is more liberal than every Republican, and it hasn't always been that way. So where just 30 years ago, 60% of the Senate was comprised of moderates, today, literally, there are none. Factor 2, something else that occurs to me as I reflect on the time period that I've been paying attention, the simultaneous change that has taken place in the media and specifically in the world of talk radio and cable television news. When I left this campus and got involved in media endeavors, it was at a FM radio talk station in Philadelphia. And if you're local to the area, you'll remember 96.5 FM WWDB, or as we called it at the time, the talk station. And I think about the lineup on that station when I was beginning. There was a conservative, his name was Dominic Quinn, but he was best known not for his ideology, but for his command of the English language. He was really a gifted presenter. There was an unabashed liberal named Frank Ford. Frank Ford was married to the Democratic District Attorney of Philadelphia, Lynn Abraham, for many, many years. There was a libertarian before the rest of us had ever heard of Ron, much less Rand Paul. His name was Irv Homer. And the person that I think of is Bernie Herman. He used to host from 10 p.m. until 1 a.m. And his shtick, his moniker, we didn't know at the time to call it his brand, but he billed himself as the gentleman of broadcasting. And I think to myself that if today I were younger and I were trying to get involved in the world of talk radio or cable television news, and I were able to get the attention of a program director and they said, well, what's your show all about? And if my response were to say, I'm the gentleman of broadcasting, I'm not getting on that station. It all changed in the early 1990s. It changed at the station where I was broadcasting, and it changed at stations all across the country because they were all like that. The litmus test was personality. Could you conduct a conversation, not whether you were lockstep with either a conservative or a liberal perspective on every single issue. What changed in the early 90s was the outbreak of the first Gulf War and the success that Rush Limbaugh had in Sacramento, and then his ensuing syndication. And I get it in retrospect. I think that conservatives rightfully believed that there was no place that they could call home in the media. The media world consisted of ABC, NBC, CBS, the New York Times, the Washington Post. Conservatives didn't have a place where they could go and feel comfortable. And talk radio became that clubhouse. And so after the success of Limbaugh and the imitators that he had across the country, Fox News rolled out in 1996. And they took a page from the talk radio handbook, and they were immensely successful. MSNBC struggled for a period of years. Many don't remember that Phil Donahue was actually the first name personality that MSN rolled out. They didn't get it together until they unleashed Keith Olbermann to do those rants against President George W. Bush in the waning years of the Bush administration. What happened in the interim? CNN languished. Because now it was incivility, it was partisanship, it was polarization. Sure, we all still went and still go to CNN for that breaking story, but it seems that the minute that we know what that story is, we go among the like-minded and try and get our spin and our interpretation. I don't see this as a coincidence that Washington went polar in the same time period that the media did. I maintain that the media went polar and took our elected officials with it. There are other drivers of the polarization that confronts us. A third factor, at least according to me, hyperpartisan districts, gerrymandered districts. Nate Silver, who used to be at the New York Times at the 538 blog and now is at ESPN, has done some great research on this. He documents how, if you go back to 1992, there were 103 competitive congressional districts in the country. A competitive congressional district defined as one where the presidential race was going to be determined within 5 percentage points. Today, only 35. Only 35. And so, if you wonder why on issues where it seems that there's a consensus among the American people can't Washington get it together, it's because they're responding to a district that's tailor-made for their ideology. And consequently, there's no accountability when they go home. You know, 90% of the American people may have wanted Toomey Manchin to pass so that there'd be a universal background check if you purchase a firearm. And then you say, well, why couldn't Washington pass that? It's because they were all going home to like-minded districts that don't demand compromise. A fourth consideration, closed primaries. And Pennsylvania is a great example of this, where only Republicans can vote in a GOP primary and only Democrats can vote in a Democratic primary. Who comes out in primaries? The most passionate. And who are they? The most ideologically driven. If you want to know why Republicans don't control the Senate today, it's because they nominated too many ideologues. Names like Christine O'Donnell, Todd Akin, Richard Murdoch. A great illustration was right in Delaware, where here was Mike Castle, a former governor, a former member of Congress, who runs for the U.S. Senate against a candidate whose only credential, frankly, was that she once told Bill Maher that she'd dabbled in witchcraft. And she beat him. And how did she beat him? She beat him because 16% of the electorate came out in that primary. Who were they? They were passionate. They were ideologically driven. So I think that closed primaries are a consideration. And of course, and this is my fifth factor, money plays a big role. We've witnessed the whole deregulation of the campaign expenditure process. It's incredible to me that these individuals work so hard to get elected, raise so much money to get elected, and then are only in Washington Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. And only in Washington Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, pretty much in sync with the school calendar. And all the rest of that time, they're out in the hinterland raising funds. Consequently, they're not breaking bread with one another. They're not having a cocktail with one another. It's much harder to demonize someone if you've socialized with them, but they don't even live in D.C. Residing in Washington today means that you have space in a flop house on Capitol Hill with some ideological twins. We were better served in the day when being elected and going to Congress meant you relocated your family there, put them in schools there, broke bread with one another. I think that's a factor in terms of what drives the incivility and the gridlock. You probably know the name Bill Bishop. He's credited with the big sort hypothesis. I think this is another consideration. I think this is another factor when you ask, well, how did we get where we are today? He argues that we've been self-sorting into like-minded communities. He says that it's a process that began in the mid-'60s. No longer are we joining the Elks. No longer are men at the Rotary. No longer are we in the local bowling league. We broke apart from one another. There was another book, it was called Bowling Alone, which documents some of these same trends. And then when we reconnected as a society, we reconnected amongst tribes of like-minded interests. The big sort isn't a political phenomena, but it's a context in which our politics occurs. We've sequestered ourselves with people who see the world the same way that we do. I have so many friends who, after the 2012 election, it was like a truck hit them because they were conservative and very much wanting and expecting that Mitt Romney was going to win. But they'd been getting all of their news from Drudge, from Fox, and from Talk. I have a similar group of friends. They're completely reliant upon Huffington Post and MSNBC. It's amazing to me that we've never had so much choice as we exist or can take advantage of in 2014, and yet so few seem to take advantage of it. You know, you've got the internet now, and you've got cable now, and you've got Sirius XM now, in addition to AM, FM radio, and yet it seems that very few people are willing to spin that dial. An eighth consideration out of 9. I call it the city versus country divide. There's always been a political difference between rural America and more urban or suburban America, but this too has become more pronounced. It hasn't always been this way, but now Republicans are the rural party. The Democrats are the party of the urban and initial layer of suburban real estate. And I like to explain it this way. Whole Foods and Cracker Barrel don't often build in the same communities. I think they're in tune with what I'm trying to describe for all of you in terms of the polarization. And I saw some interesting info at the Wall Street Journal. Again, on the premise that Whole Foods and Cracker Barrel aren't in the same town. I happen to live in a community. We have one of each, and we truly are one of those very few swing districts that I mentioned a moment ago. In 1992, Bill Clinton won 60% of counties with a Whole Foods. He only carried 40% that had a Cracker Barrel. In 2012, Barack Obama won 77% of communities with a Whole Foods and only 29% of those with a Cracker Barrel. In other words, in 1992, there was a 20-point differential, and it had grown by 2012 to 48 points. What's driving some of this? I think in a bad economy, fewer job opportunities in rural America. Those who are educated and come from those communities can and do leave in search of better employment opportunities. Consequently, there's less change because there's not an influx of new blood in those towns. 2 more. One consideration that I hadn't thought of until I did some research and read from an author named Avi Tuckman is the role of education and evolution. There's been a massive increase in education in this country in the span of the last 30 or 40 years, especially among women. The number of females who have obtained degrees has quintupled. You say, well, what does that have to do with polarization? Research shows that the higher our level of educational attainment, the more concrete become our political views. So that a liberal with more education is more of a doctrinaire liberal, a conservative who has more education is a more doctrinaire conservative. We also still experience in this country what we call assortative mating. We still are marrying people with similar interests, backgrounds, experiences, and political views. So put it all together. An increase in education has brought on a rise in certainty among political viewpoints. We engage in assortative mating. We have choice as to where we live. Conservatives are marrying conservatives, and liberals are marrying liberals. The final factor, if I'm asked, what's driving the polarization, number 9 would be social media. Robert Reich was Bill Clinton's Secretary of Labor, and he wrote something for the New York Times recently under the headline of bile. He talked about how he'd been walking through an airport and someone had shouted out at him, "You're a communist scumbag." And he engaged the person in conversation, wanting to know, well, where did this viewpoint come from? Reich, in his opinion, says that this is all about income inequality. He thinks that income inequality and the growing gap between the very wealthy and not so wealthy in this country is fostering political incivility and some of the gridlock and polarization that I'm describing. I don't know about that. I leave that territory to him. But in his explanation, he talked about social media. He talked about Twitter. He talked about Facebook. That I understand very well. People are, because of what I do for a living, they'll often stop and engage me in a conversation about politics. It happened when I came in the door here in Linderman. People are always very gracious, even if they don't agree with what I have to say, when we have face-to-face encounters. You can't imagine what people say about me via Twitter or Facebook. We have 3 sons at home, and our middle son, he's now 16. When he was 12, 13, and coming of age and going online, he would constantly bring me things that he'd printed out from the internet that had been said about me, and he'd say, "Dad, do you know this person?" I would never know. I knew none of the people that were making these comments. Why did I know them? Because they were anonymous. And when you have the power of voicing your opinion with anonymity, you would never say the sort of things that you'd say if you were standing on a soapbox so that everybody in a room like this could see your face. I'm really worried about that. I think that the social media has made it too easy to say nasty things, to hurt people's feelings, and to cause others to want to stay out of the fray. You know, I'm of an era when if you wanted to ask someone on a date, you had to call on a rotary phone and live in fear that the old man was going to pick up the phone and you'd have to go through him to get to her. But today, I think that the kids, and now I sound like the old guy, although it is the 30th reunion, but they're being raised minus social skills. And I think that causes a lot of what I'm discussing as well. So I see, to sum up, Washington today is a manifestation of all of these things. A media that has gone polar and taken politicians with it. Hyperpartisan districts contributing a lot. Closed primaries accentuating these circumstances. More fundraising, less socializing. We're limiting our associations with fellow citizens as we bowl alone. Cultural change coming much too slowly for rural, economically challenged areas. More education combined with assortative mating and mobility furthering the divide. And finally, the internet has made it very easy to spread bile. And as I like to say, welcome to my world. Because this is the environment in which I have to compete as a media person on a day-to-day basis. And I've had to ask myself, in which direction do I wish to go to try and have a program that's successful? I have recently bet my livelihood on the fact that there's an audience out there that desires more substantive, interesting, but substantive conversation that doesn't play itself out in some base level of communication. I left 80 terrestrial radio stations a year ago, April, to go to Sirius XM because I no longer wanted to be identified by all of those who were surrounding me on the radio dial. I wanted to try and cut my own path. And in similar fashion, having spent 4+ years guest hosting Hardball for Chris Matthews, when the opportunity recently arose to go to CNN, I thought that would be a better place for me to be. I was always insufficiently conservative for Fox, insufficiently liberal for MSNBC, but what I reflect on is the fact that when I'm leading my real life, and if I live in the suburbs of Philadelphia, if I'm at a back-to-school night, doing grocery shopping for our house, pumping gas, having those kinds of experiences, and people would engage me in conversation, they would not be like the media personalities that I'd rub shoulders with. I mean, I meet people for whom the issues are a mixed bag. They're often liberal on social issues, more conservative on fiscal issues, and there are a whole host of things that they just haven't figured out, and they're not afraid to say that. And the data supports that the bulk of the country is somewhere in the middle. Gallup in January did an exhaustive survey and said that 42% of Americans regard themselves not as R's, not as D's, but as I's. Esquire magazine, just last November, engaged both the Romney and Obama pollsters to come together, take the pulse of America. They ended up at the same point, saying there are more individuals somewhere in the loosely identified middle than there are at either of the polar exchange ends of the spectrum. So this is the context in which the 2014 and 2016 elections are going to play themselves out. And if you're sitting there and you're thinking, okay, Michael, maybe it's a logical case that you're making, but why then isn't the group that you're identifying the dominant factor year in and year out in elections? Well, I maintain that we are, or they are. I don't want to presume that you're in that group. And that's why presidential elections are so much different than midterm elections like we're about to experience. I think 2014 is going to be a big year for the Republican Party. It's interesting, I think, that even though the country is split in a general sense on the future of the Affordable Care Act, passion lies on the Republican side of the aisle. Those folks are coming out to vote because it's a protest vote against Obamacare. He will not be there to defend it. His name's not on the ballot. I think that most Democrats who are seeking office are going to be reluctant to be supportive of the Affordable Care Act, and so it's going to almost be a mismatch on that issue. But I would say don't confuse what happens in 2014 with what's to come in 2016. And I say that because in 2016, a whole host of folks who will sit out 2014 are going to come back and to vote. The people who sit out 2014 are those constituencies on which the Democrats most heavily rely. women, young people, African Americans. I think they'll take a pass in 2014. It'll be a strong GOP year. That then might alter the landscape for who the Republicans put forth in 2016. But I think that 2016 is a year that'll favor the Ds unless Republicans come to terms with the demographic issue that confronts the party. Jeb Bush recently said some things that he suggested were off the cuff and extemporaneous. I didn't think so. He did an interview at his father's library, and he was being interviewed by Fox, and this is that speech or those comments where he said that he interprets the folks who got here illegally as representing an act of love. I think that was him floating a trial balloon to see how much resistance he would get within the Republican Party if he chose that path on which to travel. I think he also recognizes that long-term the GOP faces an existential threat unless they can grow the tent. So, when does it change? When does the climate that I have described change? I think it changes only when people start making different decisions about where to get their news and information. I think it changes only when we professionalize the drawing of legislative boundaries. I think it changes only when we open primaries, where we institute campaign finance reform, and only when independent thinkers engage in the process at the same level of participation as those who are on the fringe. I want to make sure that I leave time for us to have a conversation and for me to respond to some questions, but I would be derelict in my duty if I didn't stand here at Linderman and tell you the real story as to how I got in the position that I'm in today of being able to talk politics with all these different platforms. So here's that story. I graduated from high school at Central Bucks West in Doylestown. My father had obtained his master's at Lehigh. My brother was a member of the class of I'm 84, he's 80. My brother was president of the class of 1980. I was a legacy. I told the story recently in print because I'm no longer embarrassed about it, that but for Sam Missimer being the director of admissions and taking pity on me in the Alumni Memorial Building, I would never have gotten into Lehigh with my SAT of 990. Can you imagine? And I was so unsettled when I was admitted because I thought I didn't deserve to be here. Dave Amidon was the one-man, yes, we can applaud for Amidon. He was the one-man director of the Urban Studies Department. The Urban Studies Department in Chandler, Ullman, here, consisted of one person. And I came up for, I think it was Greek Week, in my brother's senior year, my senior year of high school, and a fraternity brother of my brother, Jack Archibald, give Jack a shout out, said to me, as you're planning your courses, there's a guy whose class you need to take. His name is Dave Amidon. He's a wonderful lecturer. He's going to really work you. So my first semester here, I had either US 61 or 62. All I remember is we read Jane Jacobs that year. And I was so intellectually turned on by Dave Amidon that I came back for another Amidon course every single semester. It's amazing I didn't at least get a minor in urban studies. Maybe they can give me, for speaking here today, can I please have an honorary urban studies minor? My God, is that too much to ask? But this guy lit such a fuse in me, Professor Amidon did, and okay, I gave you the bad news, 990. I graduated Phi Beta Kappa, and I then went to Penn for law school, and it was all because of him. He just so turned me on, and I became such a fan of this whole environment. But getting back to politics, in my senior year of high school, and this was now the spring of 1980, my father ran for the state legislature in Bucks County. He hadn't been active politically. He decided to throw his hat into the ring in an open state legislative race. Dad ended up losing that race, but I was completely gung-ho about politics and GOP politics in particular. I then arrived on this campus in the fall of 1980, mistakenly believing that so was everyone else. Ronald Reagan and George Bush were now the GOP ticket against Jimmy Carter and Walter Mondale. And I can be supported in this by Dave Avery, who is in the room today. I formed a club here called Lehigh University Youth for Reagan Bush. And to say that we had a real tough go would be an understatement. I couldn't get anybody interested in registering, Reagan, Bush, nothing. So I had a Lehigh brainstorm. I know what I'll do to bring the multitude of supporters of these two candidates out of their dormitories. I will have a keg party. And so I don't know if I had to rent it, but I procured the lounge at Broadhead House, and on an October 1980 evening, 3 half kegs of beer were at Broadhead for all the campus-wide supporters of Reagan and Bush. The night that I selected was a night, who knew? The Phillies were in the World Series against the Kansas City Royals for Game 2, and no one came to the keg party. I don't mean that nobody came to the keg party as a figure of speech. You're sitting there and you think, what, 20 people came, 50? No. Nobody came. And all the beer went back to Taylor, which was still 150 guys where I was living at the time. And frankly, that's probably where I should have been that night, drinking beer and watching the World Series. Taylor at the time was all male, pre-internet, pre-cell phone. It took an act of divine intervention for you to receive a competent phone message from your parents, your girlfriend, or anyone else, which is why this is amazing, because soon after that party, the phone rang, and it was someone from the National Reagan-Bush campaign looking for Micheal Smerconish, the president of Lehigh University Youth for Reagan-Bush. So with the memory of the party firmly in my head, I thought I was getting pranked from somebody at Draveau, calling over. So I picked up the phone and I said, well, who exactly is looking for me? And the person at the other end of the phone said, well, this is Dan Sullivan, and I'm the director of advance for Ambassador George Bush. So yes, Mr. Sullivan, how can I help you? George Bush, in the waning days of that campaign, was coming to tour Beth Steel. And the campaign in a pre-9/11 world, if you can imagine this, needed college students to drive the motorcade cars. So I hung up the phone, knocked on the door of my freshman hall mates, and I said, who wants to go to work for George Bush for a couple of days? Now I had a lot of volunteers, communists, Democrats, Republicans. Dave, were you involved in that? Were you involved in that? You were involved in that. Okay, so, and you remember then that the future vice president then came to ABE Airport, worked Beth Steel, we drove the cars, we escorted the press. He stayed at the Sheraton in Allentown, which had 7 or 8 stories. How do I know? Do you remember? The elevators broke, and we had to carry the luggage all the way up. So you know that expression, oh, he carried the bags for? I really did carry the bags for. The net for me is that Bush goes on to be vice president. The guy who once had to humble himself to call a freshman in Taylor House became the director of advance, recruited me to do advance work for then Vice President Bush, and when Vice President Bush becomes President Bush, I'm then tapped to be the head of housing and urban development in 5 states in Washington, D.C. My point is that it all came out of the only keg party in Lehigh history that was a bust. I'd be thrilled to entertain a comment or a question, anything anybody would like to say. We always need that one icebreaker, so let's just get to it. Who's going to be the icebreaker? Perfect, right there.
Being an engineer and having my wife work at the polls for 30 years, and I've off and on worked at the polls, I said, I can tell you this, voter ID with the picture ID is really necessary if you have a lot of people at the polls. It takes exactly half the time to process a person with a picture ID. Now it really helps if you happen to know a lot of the people, and if you've been working at the same polls for 20 to 30 years, like my wife has, she knows a good many of the people. But what we're saying is when we see these long lines out in Ohio in a presidential election, keep in mind that the engineer is the one that thinks, what difference does a voter ID make? And what it makes is half the time for the person to see who it is, look at the name that's on the printed ID, open the book up, find the place where they have to sign, have them sign. They're gone. They don't have to stumble over names that they don't know or haven't heard before. So as a method of speeding up voting. Voter ID is a great idea. And I would like to have any judge that opposes this to sit down at 7 o'clock in the morning, get up at 8 o'clock at night, after having to listen to all those people come in and give their names, and tell them, what do you think? Wouldn't you like to have a picture ID so it'd make it much easier?
I'm fine with voter ID so long as the form of ID respects who lives in that particular community and is of the nature that they're likely to possess. Because I don't buy into the idea that we need it as a means of protecting ballot security, because there's never been a documentation of voter fraud that warrants that. I think the fundamental question is this: you want mass participation or not? I do. I think we ought to be looking for ways to make it certainly protected, but inclusive. We should be expanding in a state like Pennsylvania. To me, it's lunacy that we should be voting from 7 a.m. until 8 p.m. one day. For all that's at stake one day, can't we at least expand into a weekend? But I have no problem with saying you're going to show an ID, but let's make sure it's an ID that people possess. And if you're talking about folks in the inner city and they don't drive cars and they don't have driver's licenses, then it shouldn't be a driver's license, in my view.
No, that's picture ID. We don't care what it is. And it's basically to speed up the voting. I'm not particularly concerned with dead people voting or anything like that, because we know a lot of the people that vote in
Understood.
our district over 30 years. It isn't that. It speeds up voting. It makes it a lot easier for the people sitting down there voting. And by the way, I disagree with you. I'd like to see the elections all done in one day at one time zone. It's a little difficult because we live in 5 different time zones.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. Yes, sir.
Give us a 2016 prediction.
I think that Hillary is tough to stop. I think that Hillary is very, very tough to stop. In my view, I can tell you who can't beat her. Marco Rubio can't beat her. Mike Huckabee can't beat her. Rick Santorum can't beat her. The usual suspects cannot beat her, in my opinion. Jeb Bush could give her a run. Jeb Bush could give her a run, I think, because of that speech that he delivered recently. He's trying to serve notice that he is, you know, let me back up and say this. I don't think that Papa Bush or Ronald Reagan could meet the litmus tests that now exist in this party. It is not the party that I was passing out flyers trying to get people to register in when I was on this campus 30 years ago. There's been a sea change. And so I think that the GOP is going to have to decide, you know, do they want to win? Frank Colin was my government professor here at Lehigh. I'll never forget what he said to me. Political parties exist for one purpose: to win elections. That's gotten lost on the Republican side of the aisle. They've become an ideological vessel, and it hasn't served the party well. I would have said Chris Christie, maybe, before the whole Bridgegate controversy, but as I look at the field now, there will be moments, no matter who the GOP nominee is, there will be moments where it's going to be a close race, because that's the nature of our business. So it will draw close, but in the end, only Jeb, I think, at this stage, can beat her.
If the Republican Party wants to get back to where it was, the moderates you remember so well,
Right.
how do they do it?
So I think what the GOP can do is, for starters, look seriously at immigration reform. And do something on that basis, and also figure out a way to dilute the influence of the ideologically driven vote in the primary process. They know this. A great example, 2 weeks ago, Reince Priebus, the head of the RNC, has altered the debate process that's now going to play itself out in 2016. They're going to cut the number of debates in half, because they realize that giving all that airtime to so many different candidates is giving too much attention to the aberrant points of view. I think they've got to go a step further, and they've got to stop staging them in front of such partisan audiences. I mean, a guy comes out and asks a question on YouTube in the last cycle about don't ask, don't tell, and when he reveals himself as having served his country and being gay, he was booed. When Rick Perry announced the number of executions that he'd carried out in Texas, it drew an enormous round of applause. When Ron Paul talked about how somebody who shows up at an ER shouldn't be treated if they don't have insurance, even if it means they die, that got a round of applause. They've got to rein in the fringe factor and let everybody else know that they're open for business. Well, I just gave you a couple of examples. Listen, I'll give you here. You want the real measure? Open the primary process. Let independents participate in the selection of your candidates, because you're going to need them in the fall anyway. Yeah, in the back.
Where do eyes go where would you recommend eyes go for news when you're turned off by the fringes? You don't want to hear the repeats. Where do you go?
Well, it's okay if you go to the fringes, but dilute them with one another. You know, there's nothing wrong with getting your information from Fox, but get a little MSN in there in the same time. If you're hooked on, not a day goes by that I don't look at Drudge multiple times, but I'm going to take my Drudge with a teaspoon or two of Huffington Post as well. You know, sample the dial. I'm watching this whole commencement process unfold right now. It's so indicative of what's going on. The UC Berkeley chancellor, UC Berkeley, was now turned down at Haverford College, you know, as being too politically incorrect for that. Christine Lagarde of the IMF at Smith can't speak. Condi Rice turned away. Actually, she withdrew. I thought she handled it in a very classy fashion. At Rutgers, if you can't have an open conversation and dialogue on a college campus and for 20 minutes sit still with an alternative point of view being presented, that to me really says we're in a bad spot. So change the dial is what I would say. I'm not going to direct you to one source because I sure don't rely on any one source myself. Yes, sir.
Do you believe that there's any news network that is politically unbiased?
Are we recording this?
Besides CNN.
Besides CNN, thank you. Oh, I think everybody has biases, and I used to be someone who would talk about the liberal media because I think back in the days when I was here, it was a truism. You know, Sam Donaldson and Peter Jennings and a little Mike Wallace on 60 Minutes, the big three networks and those two newspapers, they were the media. But I don't today, is there bias out there? Of course there is, but you've got so much information available to you that whatever you want, you can now receive. So I would take a composite of everything that's out there. I wish I had my laptop here. I would open up my favorites and I would show you that there are probably 50 different sources that I won't rely on any one of them. I'll just hit them all if I want to know what's going on in a particular. Don't rely on one person. Not me, not anyone else. That would be my advice. I don't have all the answers. Yes?
Mike, given how many people identify themselves more in the middle, and also how much of the parties is being controlled by what you would call fringe candidates, do you think there's a time in the near future where another party might rise?
Yes, I thought that was going to happen in the last presidential race. There was a group that was incredibly well-funded. I think it was from Wall Street, and their name was Americans Elect. Initially, I didn't buy into it because the concept was that through an internet-based campaign, they were going to get ballot position in all 50 states. And I thought there's no way they'll ever be able to navigate the cumbersome rules of that process to get your name on the ballot. Well, I was wrong. They ended up getting clearance, I want to say, on 46 or 47 ballots. And in the end, they couldn't field a candidate that they thought could win. So they went through this elaborate process, and people could nominate different candidates. Gary Johnson, who had been the governor of New Mexico, I think, was the name that came forth. And those who were behind the effort thought they were going to be embarrassed with his showing, and they folded the tent. The fact that they got as close as they were to getting a name on so many ballots told me that it can be done. And I think if the right candidate should emerge, that you'll see a movement like that. And if you were to say to me, who might that person be in contemporary politics? Apparently he's not doing it. But if someone like Mike Bloomberg took a shot and wrote the check, I think he could become a serious third-party candidate, and maybe he'd then open the door, and I think that that would be a great thing. I see I'm about to get my hook. Oh, one more, right here, and then I'll get the hook.
What can media do to bring the extremes closer to the center? Or are we just, media's a commercial industry and they compete for eyeballs and attention?
Well, the media that I'm talking about are being fed by this process. It's not in their interest to change it. I think it's in the nation's interest to change it. Now, there's a demographic problem for the talk radio community. They're not going to be able to play this for much longer. I saw ratings yesterday that showed that Rush Limbaugh's program in Southern California is now 39th in the market. And the demographic to which it appeals is a vanishing demographic. So over time, attrition may take care of this. I don't know. But in the book that I've just written, it's a novel, but much of what you've just heard me say, I wove into this book because I wanted to make real points as I was telling the story. There's a conservative talk radio host who's my protagonist. He's in Tampa's I-4 corridor, and he knows nothing about talk radio. He knows nothing about politics, and yet he's an overnight sensation. How? Why? Because there's a consultant who whispers in his ear and says, you simply keep saying these things, bang the same drum, and you'll be a hit. And he is, and he becomes a kingmaker. One of the exchanges between the radio host and the consultant, frankly, not so fictitious, is that the consultant says to him, never forget, 3 ideologues are worth more than 10 moderates. And what's meant by that is that ratings are largely driven not necessarily by your gross audience, but by your time spent listening or watching. If you're a broadcaster, if you're a radio presenter, it's more advantageous to you to have a few hardcore types than to try and reach a mass audience that's tuning in and tuning out. So the media is not about to change this dynamic. It's up to you to change it by turning the dial. Thanks very much.